Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children. But they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending October 5, 2024. Our first story comes to us from the Financial Times, and it reports that CEOs are turning to podcast to get their message out. Why? Well, it allows them more time to explain and explore their businesses and what drives them as people. What's the result of this? Well, it actually improves corporate culture. Why? Because employees can actually listen to their CEO. Most employees have never met their CEO if they work for a multinational organization. And this is a great way for CEOs to get their message out in a forum that is relaxed and they can actually have a conversation. So if you're a CEO, you'd like to find out more, give me a shout. Next up from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Mingy Sun reporting that Frances Haugen has made the case for more whistleblowing in the age of AI. Who is she? Well, she's the former Facebook product manager who whistleblew on Facebook and formed the basis of the Wall Street Journal's Facebook Files series. She says that as AI becomes more ubiquitous, she believes that companies or people need to step forward. And last year, she published her memoir, The Power of One, which helped refine her thoughts around raising your hand and speaking up. So do we need more whistleblowers? Well, one of the top whistleblowers in the past few years thinks we do. Next up from Reuters, Britain has proposed new powers for banks in their fights against fraudsters. In the United Kingdom, banks have 24 hours to decide or not to pay a wire transfer. Well, now they're going to give banks up to 72 hours where there are reasonable grounds to suspect a payment may be fraudulent. So more tools for British banks to fight fraud. Next up from Bloomberg, in a very interesting article, it equates philandering CEOs to those who engage in dodgy activity. Why? Well, it's because if you're willing to have a romantic relationship outside of your marriage, it could be that you are willing to make trade-offs inside your corporation as well. Having a romantic relationship with an employee did not used to be a fireable offense, but now it is. And many corporate boards are now putting in no tolerance policies for CEOs, and there's clearly a cultural shift on executives' dalliances with others. But the larger point is that if you're willing to cheat on your spouse, are you willing to cheat at work? And I think that's perhaps the bigger point that may need additional exploration. In our second article from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, this time Dylan Tokar reporting that SEC Enforcement Director Gurbir Grewal is stepping down next week. He was the former New Jersey Attorney General who became the Director of Enforcement, who pushed big fines against companies who violated the law. He was advocating bigger fines for securities violators and took a tough stance on cryptocurrency. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the SEC continues in this vein. Chairman Gary Gensler, of course, is still there, so my suspicion is that, yes, we will still see robust SEC enforcement, at least through the end of the Biden administration. Next up in our third article from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, this time David Smagala reporting that the ghost of Odebrecht lives on as Ecuador's ex-controller gets a 10-year sentence in a bribery case which was tied to Odebrecht. The individual will also forfeit $16.5 million for accepting more than $10 million in bribes from the Brazilian construction company, the disgraced Brazilian construction company. This happened between 2010 and 2015, where the former Comptroller General solicited and received more than $10 million in bribes in exchange to use his position as Ecuador's Comptroller General to benefit the company and its business throughout the country, removing fines on projects and approving other projects. Next up from the BBC, what is modern slavery? Well, in the United Kingdom, it's in McDonald's. Yes. McDonald's hired people who were in slavery to work for them, working sometimes 70 to 100-hour weeks. This is just unbelievable that a company as ubiquitous and you would think as sophisticated as McDonald's would do so, but they did in the United Kingdom. The victims, who were all vulnerable and had nearly all of their pay stolen by their masters. They received a few pounds a day and lived in sheds or unheated caravans. What are some of the red flags that McDonald's missed? Well, the victims' wages were paid into bank accounts in other people's names. The victims were unable to speak English, and job applications were completed by their slave masters. Victims worked extreme hours. I mentioned the 70 to 100 hours, and multiple employees had the same address. So, modern slavery existing at McDonald's. Next up from Reuters, it reports that the district court in Dallas will hear or hold a hearing on the proposed settlement by Boeing with the Department of Justice, which the victims' families have objected to. This is the one where there will be a monitor selected by the Department of Justice and an additional criminal penalty assessed against Boeing. The families don't believe this is enough, so we're going to see what the court may have to say. Next up from the Securities and Exchange Commission, this time from an SEC press release, 11 more firms have agreed to pay in total more than $77 million in fines and penalties for off-channel communications. And our final story comes to us from the New York Times, and it's the unfortunately sad story of the indictment of the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, for bribery and corruption. There's a laundry list of bribery and corruption allegations made. There may be additional charges coming. Most interestingly, within days, his defense counsel filed a motion to dismiss U.S. Supreme Court that gratuities aren't bribes. Well, have a great weekend. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture, and Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.